Jesse James robbed banks and killed people, but he became an American hero. How did that happen? A journalist from Missouri made up a nice story to sell newspapers and attack the government. Hollywood bought that cheap version and repeated it for 100 years. The real Jesse was a Confederate guerrilla who never robbed the rich to give to the poor. That never happened. And the real facts are much worse. Fact 1. Jesse James got shot while trying to surrender with a white flag. In May '85, the Civil War was already over. Jesse James was just a teenager who had spent years riding with Confederate guerrillas. He wanted out. He grabbed a white cloth, went up to a Union patrol, and tried to surrender. A federal soldier shot him anyway. The bullet went through his right lung. He almost died right there, in the middle of the Missouri dust. He spent months recovering, and the whole time he was lying in that bed, one thing was becoming clear. Surrendering didn't make any difference at all. The government wasn't going to let former guerrillas just go home and move on with their lives. That one shot changed everything. The kid who wanted peace became one of the most wanted outlaws in American history. And the craziest part is that almost nobody knows this part of the story. Hollywood never tells it. Fact 2. Jesse James was a devout Baptist who went to church regularly. Imagine the most wanted man in America sitting in a church pew every Sunday. That's exactly what Jesse James did for 5 years in Nashville. He went by J.D. Howard, a quiet family man, and attended the same Baptist congregation week after week. He quoted the Bible in personal letters and made sure both of his kids were baptized. The neighbors liked him. They thought he was a serious Christian, a trustworthy guy. Nobody suspected a thing. The detail that gets you is that his faith seemed real. It wasn't just a cover. He himself said he truly believed. So there you had a man who robbed banks and trains, who had blood on his hands, and who the very next Sunday was bowing his head in prayer. That contradiction says more about Jesse James than any shootout. Fact 3. Jesse's mother sold stones from her son's grave for 25 cents. Zerelda Samuel lost her son in a brutal way, a shot in the back, inside his own home. But if you think she just sat around crying, you don't know this woman. Weeks after the burial, Zerelda was already charging 25 cents to anyone who wanted to see Jesse's grave on the farm in Kearney, Missouri. And she didn't stop there. She pulled granite stones from around the grave and sold them as souvenirs. When they ran out, she bought new ones and put them back as if they were the originals. Nobody complained. The line of curious visitors only kept growing. Zerelda understood before everyone else something that only became clear decades later. The name Jesse James was worth money. Was she a grieving mother? No doubt. But she was also a woman who knew how to do business with what she had. And what she had was the grave of America's most famous outlaw. Fact 4. The man who killed Jesse was killed the exact same way 10 years later. Bob Ford became famous for one thing: shooting Jesse James in the back. It happened in April 1882 inside Jesse's house. While he was fixing a picture on the wall, Ford became the worst kind of celebrity. Everybody knew his name, but nobody wanted to shake his hand. He opened a saloon in Creede, Colorado, trying to start over. It didn't work. In June 1892, Edward O'Kelly walked into the bar and fired 2 shotgun blasts into Ford's back. 10 years later, the same death, by the same method. Ford was only 29 years old. And the strangest part? O'Kelly was arrested and sentenced to life, but eventually got released. A popular petition argued that he had done Jesse's legacy a favor. Nobody knows if it was a coincidence. But the American public loved the symmetry and never let that story die. Fact 5. While half the country was hunting Jesse James, he was sitting somewhere reading little stories about himself. Starting in '85, cheap little magazines called dime novels became a craze in the United States. They cost a few cents and featured stories about outlaws, cowboys, and adventures in the Old West. Jesse James became a star of those publications. And the craziest part? He read those stories. Members of his own gang later said Jesse got a kick out of the exaggerated versions and would even comment on what was true and what was made up. Imagine the scene. The most wanted man in the country, hiding somewhere in Missouri, flipping through a cheap little magazine where he showed up as a hero. Jesse knew fame protected him as much as it threatened him. The more people read about him, the harder it became for any neighbor to turn him in. The legend was working in the outlaw's favor. Fact 6. Jesse's brother was acquitted of every crime and lived to be 72. Frank James was the older of the two brothers, and in the end, the one who spent the longest time in a life of crime. He spent 16 years robbing banks and trains, longer than Jesse ever managed to. When Jesse was shot dead in 1882, Frank decided to turn himself in. He went on trial for murder and several other crimes, and he was acquitted of all of them, every single one. After the justice system washed its hands of him, Frank lived a life nobody would expect from a former outlaw. He sold shoes, acted in plays, started horse races, and even became a tour guide on the very farm where he grew up. He died in 1915 at 72 years old, in the same bed, on the same farm where he was born. Jesse became a legend and took a shot to the back of the head at 34. Frank committed the same crimes, never paid for any of them, and died an old man. Fact 7. Missouri almost officially pardoned Jesse James. In '85, the Pinkerton agency attacked the James family farm in Missouri. They threw an incendiary bomb into the house. Jesse's half-brother Archie, an 8-year-old boy, died. His mother Zerelda had her arm blown off by the explosion. The attack on a family's, and not on Jesse, who wasn't even there, outraged the whole state. The backlash was so strong that lawmakers introduced an official amnesty bill for Jesse and Frank James. The state government itself considered pardoning two of the most wanted outlaws in the country. The bill was defeated by the smallest of margins. Some historians say it was only 2 votes. If it had passed, Jesse would have been a free man in '85, 7 years before Robert Ford put a bullet in his back. The Old West would have been different. Fact 8. Jesse James never robbed from the poor to give to the rich. It was the opposite. You've heard that Jesse James was America's Robin Hood, right? That story was made up from scratch. There isn't a single document proving he gave money to anyone in need. Not one. What the records show is the opposite. At least 2 robberies by his gang ruined ordinary people, workers who kept their life savings in small-town banks. They lost everything. And who created this legend? A journalist named John Newman Edwards. The guy needed a political hero to sell newspapers and chose Jesse as his character. He made up the whole narrative. It worked so well that even today most people repeat it without questioning it. The lie became more famous than the truth. And that says a lot about how we accept a good story without checking the facts. Fact 9. Cole. Younger took 11 bullets in a single day and survived. In September '86, the James Younger gang tried to rob a bank in Northfield, Minnesota. Everything went wrong. The townspeople fought back with gunfire, and what was supposed to be a quick robbery turned into a war in the streets. Cole Younger was shot several times right there. He managed to escape, but spent 2 weeks dragging himself through the Minnesota woods, bleeding and with no food, until he was captured. When doctors finally examined his body, they counted 11 bullet wounds, and the guy didn't die. He served 25 years in prison, got out, put together a Wild West show, wrote a book about his own life, and died at 72 of natural causes. 11 bullets in his body, and he died an old man. If there was anyone who refused to die in the Old West, that guy was Cole Younger. Fact 10. Jesse James had a flaw Hollywood never shows. Every movie shows Jesse James with that steady hero stare. But in real life, the guy could barely keep his eyes open properly. Jesse suffered from chronic blepharitis, an inflammation of the eyelids that made his eyes red and watery all the time. People who knew him described a man who blinked non-stop, with eyes so irritated it was impossible to ignore. It didn't mess with his aim, but it was so noticeable that witnesses used it to identify him. The most wanted outlaw in the Old West could be recognized just by his eyes. But Hollywood chose to invent a perfect-looking cowboy. In reality, Jesse was an average-height guy with eyes that wouldn't stop watering. Fact 11. The gang robbed a bank and walked away with only $80. Imagine planning a bank robbery, risking getting shot, and in the end, walking away with $80 in your pocket. Well, that's what happened to the James Younger gang. On at least 3 occasions, Jesse James and his partners stormed banks in small towns across the southern United States and came out empty-handed. The 1870s were brutal for the American economy. The Civil War had destroyed the South. Local banks barely had any cash on hand, and many existed more on paper than in practice. The gang would show up armed, threaten everybody, and when they opened the safe, they'd find an amount that barely paid for the horse's shoes. $80 was equal to a ranch hand's week of work. The famous American Robin Hood was risking his life for an amount that didn't even cover the cost of the getaway. Fact 12. The governor of Missouri paid to have Jesse James killed with railroad money. Governor Thomas Crittenden had a problem. Missouri law kept him from using public money to put a bounty on Jesse's head. The assembly blocked that idea, so Crittenden went knocking on the railroad's door. The same companies the gang had been robbing for years. They agreed to pay out of their own pockets. But the deal went beyond a reward. Crittenden sat down with Bob and Charlie Ford before the shooting and worked it all out. You kill Jesse, and I'll make sure nobody goes to prison. On April 3rd, 1882, Bob Ford shot Jesse in the back inside his own house. Hours later, Crittenden had already pardoned the Fords. The state of Missouri hired out a murder with corporate money and gave the hitmen immunity the very same day. Try finding that in a Hollywood movie. Fact 13. Jesse James prayed every day and saw nothing wrong with it. In the letters he sent to his mother and wife during the years he lived on the run, Jesse James quoted the Bible all the time. He asked for blessings, talked about salvation, and thanked God for being alive. And it wasn't an act. The guy really believed it. In his mind, the law chasing him was corrupt. The banks he robbed were tools of the devil, and if he died, it was because God wanted it that way. It all fit perfectly into a logic he had built for himself. The strangest part is that this wasn't rare in the Old West. Many outlaws had that same mix of faith and violence, as if one thing didn't cancel out the other. Jesse went even further. He prayed before bed, read passages from the New Testament, and still planned robberies the next day. He wasn't pretending to be holy. He really thought he was. Fact 14. Jim Younger, from Jesse James's gang, asked to get married. When they said no, he killed himself. Jim Younger spent 25 years locked up in a Minnesota prison. He got out in 1901 on parole that didn't allow him to leave the state. After all that, the guy just wanted to live in peace. Then in 1902, he met Alex Muller, a journalist, and fell in love. He did what any man would do. He asked the authorities for permission to get married. They said no. The reason? The marriage would create publicity and violate the terms of his parole. The man survived shootouts, a disastrous robbery in Northfield, and a quarter-century behind bars. But he couldn't handle being told he couldn't marry the woman he loved. 3 months after his request was denied, Jim killed himself with a gunshot to the head in a hotel in St. Paul. He was 54. Fact 15. In 8x, Jesse James's gang rode into Northfield, Minnesota, thinking it would be just another easy bank robbery. They were dead wrong. The townspeople grabbed rifles, shotguns, and whatever they had on hand, and opened fire on the outlaws. 2 gang members died right there, and others were captured days later. Jesse and Frank barely escaped, but the gang never recovered. What makes this different is what came after. Northfield never forgot that day. Every first weekend in September, the town holds a festival called Defeat of Jesse James Days, with shootout reenactments and museums dedicated to the confrontation. While the rest of America spent decades turning Jesse James into a movie hero, Northfield made a point of remembering the other side. Ordinary citizens stood up to the most feared outlaws in the country and won. Fact 16. Jesse James lived for 5 years in Nashville under the name J.D. Howard. He paid for everything in cash, raised horses that were way too good for a simple tenant farmer, and got strange visitors every now and then. The neighbors could tell something was off. One of them even suspected that this man wasn't who he claimed to be. But here's the detail nobody tells you. Nobody in Tennessee was looking for Jesse James. The reward was a Missouri thing. To the local authorities, that quiet man who paid on time wasn't anybody's problem. Jesse didn't survive because he was good at hiding. He survived because the bureaucracy between states made the search practically non-existent outside Missouri. He could have been arrested several times if someone had bothered. Nobody did. Fact 17. In January of 1985, Pinkerton agents threw an incendiary device into the James Samuel family home. You probably picture the Pinkertons as the lawmen. Well, on that January night in '85, they got it very wrong. The agency, backed by railroad companies, sent its men to the James Samuel family farm in Missouri. The plan was to catch Jesse and Frank James. The problem? Neither of them was even there. The agents threw an incendiary device through the window. The explosion killed Archie Samuel, Jesse's half-brother, an 8-year-old boy. Zerelda, the James brothers' mother, lost her right arm, all because of bad information. And what happened to the agents? Nothing. Not one of them went to trial. Pinkerton never admitted the mistake. That episode completely changed public opinion about Jesse James. From wanted outlaw, he became a victim in the eyes of many people. Sometimes the ones doing the hunting end up creating the myth. Fact 18. After Jesse James died in 1882, at least 6 men showed up claiming they were the real Jesse. Their story was always the same. The death had been staged, and Jesse had escaped. The craziest case was J. Frank Dalton, who showed up in 1948 in Lawton, Oklahoma, swearing he was Jesse James. The man claimed to be over 100 years old. Dalton died in 1951, and plenty of people believed him until the end. The question nobody could stop asking was simple. Who was really in that coffin? In the 1990s, they opened the grave in Kearney, Missouri, and ran a DNA test. The result, it was Jesse Woodson James, no doubt about it. But what stands out is that even with science proving it, imposters kept popping up. There's something about Jesse James that makes people want him to still be alive. like the legend was too good to end with a bullet in the back. Fact 19. Jesse James had a skill no movie ever shows. Everybody knows Jesse James as an outlaw, but few people know he understood horses better than almost anyone at the time. It wasn't just that he rode well. The guy knew how to judge breed, health, temperament, and racing potential. When he fled to Nashville under a fake name in the 1870s, he got work evaluating horses at local races. That job wasn't for just anybody. It took real knowledge, the kind farmers and breeders respected. Think about that. One of the most wanted men in America, making honest money because he knew his stuff. Decades later, Clyde Barrow became obsessed with the Ford V8. Jesse had that same obsession, only with horses. And he used that knowledge on both sides. He judged animals for farmers by day and picked the best getaway horses with that same trained eye. Fact 20. Jesse James was shot dead in the back in April 1882. The Missouri government spent 15 years trying to catch the guy and couldn't. The one who solved the problem was Bob Ford, a member of his own gang, who shot him inside his house for a $10,000 reward. The funeral took place in Kearney, Missouri, a town with fewer than 500 residents. More than 1,000 people showed up. People from other counties, reporters from St. Louis and Kansas City, curious onlookers who wanted to see the coffin of the most wanted outlaw in the country with their own eyes. That many people had never gathered in that town for anything before. Not an election, not a fair, not any celebration. The state failed to capture Jesse alive, but in death he became the biggest event Kearney had ever seen. Sometimes a guy becomes more famous after he dies than when he was alive causing trouble. Fact 21. In 15 years of robberies, the James Younger gang took somewhere between $200,000 and $300,000 from banks and trains. Sounds like a lot of money. But the deal that actually ended, Jesse didn't cost anywhere near that much. Governor Thomas Crittenden, backed by the railroad companies, offered $10,000 for his head. Bob Ford accepted the deal and pulled the trigger in April 1882. Now think about this. The gang's biggest robbery brought in $35,000 in one shot. The reward for Jesse was less than a third of that. The railroads spent years covering huge losses from the robberies. But when it came time to end the problem for good, the price was a bargain. The system didn't need an army or an ambush. It needed a friend willing to betray him for a handful of dollars. And it worked. Fact 22. Frank James beat the system in his own backyard. The thing about Frank James's trial is simple. The outcome was decided before it even started. He was tried in Clay County, Missouri, the same place where the James brothers grew up. The people there still held grudges from the Civil War and hated the Northern railroads. When Frank sat in that courtroom, he wasn't facing strangers. He was facing neighbors. The jury barely needed any time. Not guilty. The prosecutor later admitted he knew from day one he would never get a conviction there, no matter the evidence. Think about that. The second most famous outlaw in Missouri walked into the one courtroom in America where the law couldn't touch him. Nobody bought the jury. Nobody had to. The whole county had already made up its mind long before the trial even began. Fact 23. Between 1879 and 1882, Jesse James lived through the craziest 3 years of his life. He went back to robbing, put together a new gang, tried to negotiate amnesty with the Missouri government, and was still being hunted by half a dozen posses at the same time. The guy was literally playing both sides, planning to turn himself in legally while setting up the next robbery. And this is where things get heavy. In April 1882, when Bob Ford pulled the trigger from behind, Jesse was thinking about changing his name again and disappearing into a Western territory. He read those cheap little novels that told stories about himself. He went to church on Sunday and robbed trains on Monday. His gang was already rotten from the inside, full of people ready to sell him out for a reward. Hollywood turned this into a pretty little Western tale, but the real story is way dirtier and way more interesting than any movie ever managed to show.